Hey everybody, Ethan here from WordTech back with another video, and today I wanted to cover some stuff related to pfSense and the way it handles aliases, along with actually talking about a bit of a bug that might be tripping some of you up if you use pfSense and use aliases a lot. I've already submitted a bug report for that, so it'll probably be fixed at some point. Who knows when? It could even be before this goes live. But I wanted to go ahead and just do a bit of a, I don't know if deep dive is the right term, but a bit of a in-depth video on aliases and just some quirks, or maybe not even quirks, but just some notes to keep in mind about them. So I figured I would go ahead and make this video. So for those of you that are used to firewalls, aliases are probably pretty familiar. For those of you that might be new to firewalls, aliases might be something that you don't understand yet. So aliases are designed, most modern firewalls support them one way or another. Some of them call them like objects and other stuff like that. But basically, aliases are here to make your life easier. They're here to make it so that you can create firewall rules based on text rather than based on just numbers. So you can keep track of IP addresses, ports, and other things like that in aliases and refer to them via a similar, name, like a easily identifiable name. So it's almost similar to like a DNS, right, where everything communicates on the internet with IP addresses, but we go to facebook.com, right? It's just easier for us to remember names and words than it is to remember strings of numbers, or at least for most of us. So aliases are here to make all of that easy for you, and they're really useful. A lot of people that do a lot of firewalling, including myself, will create an enormous number of aliases. We try to keep them, as simple as possible, but in big environments, it's extremely helpful to be able to refer to stuff based on a name rather than based on their IP address, and maybe even more importantly, to be able to set up groups of aliases, because it's very important to have groups of IP addresses. I should say groups of aliases is also a thing. I'll get into that, nesting aliases, but groups of IP addresses. So if you have a whole bunch of servers, like you run a bunch of web servers or something like that, and they all need to be exposed the same way on the internet, then you can use aliases to make that really, really easy. Or maybe that's not even the best example, but I think you get the idea. You can use them in things like firewall rules and stuff like that, so that you can very easily reference a very large number of IP addresses or ports, or also make it so that it's just easier to remember things. So I'll talk about them kind of in order here. I've got the aliases table open, but I've created some examples here because I actually wanted to show a few things here related to IP aliases in specific before we even get into other stuff. And some of this actually will tie into a package called pfBlocker that's extremely common on pfSense. So I'll show you that in a minute as well. Now, the potential bug that I came across is related to alias nesting. So I've got a nest created here. Now, first I'll go over these two aliases that I created though. So we've got a single testing 123 hosts alias. I'm actually going to change this to testing hosts so it makes a little bit more sense. So we've got testing hosts, and this is a single host in here. This is just Cloudflare's public DNS IP, just an example that I used. So that's a single host, and then we've also got a network one. Now, the network one is designed so, or the network one is set up so that you have the ability to use CIDR notation to define entire subnets. So here, I've got a couple /32s. These are just random IPs that I put in here. Those will be referenced as a single IP address, so that's why they're /32. But also, I've got a /24, and this should be 0. I've got a /24 in here. This will reference every IP address in that subnet range. So if you needed to allow two different subnets to communicate with each other via a firewall rule or something like that, then you could create an alias like this referencing that entire subnet, and it makes it really easy to create cross-subnet communication based on a nice, easy to understand name rather than trying to actually remember the subnets. So this is the setup I've got here. This is the networks one. So that's the difference between IPs, or hosts, and network aliases. So the host aliases only allows for single IP entries, and then you've got the network alias that allows you to actually define both IP addresses, which would be a /32 single subnet of just a single IP, or an entire subnet in whatever range you want. You could even of course change this to a smaller subnet mask. So I'm going to save that. So we've got these two entries here. One other thing that I would like to show you about host aliases that's kind of cool though, is if you need to identify a range, but you need them to be a host alias for whatever reason, you can't actually identify like an entire range in here, because you would need to be using subnet masking and stuff for that. But what you can do is you can put in a range and it will do a conversion for you. So if I put in 1.1.1.2 through .5 and I save this, look at that. It created a whole bunch of entries for me. So now I open this, and now you've got .2, .3, .4, and .5. Those are all in here. So just a little thing that can make your life a little bit easier if you're configuring a large number of aliases like I have had to in the past. So that's one other thing that I wanted to show. We've got the nested alias here as well, and I have this one pre-created for a reason, but I'm actually going to create a new one first to show you, because there's a little bit of a misunderstanding in the pfSense documentation. The documentation itself specifically says that aliases must be either the same or compatible types in order to nest them. And nesting aliases is exactly what it sounds like. You are referencing multiple aliases within an alias. It makes it really easy to have like groups that you identify where maybe you need more strict controls around certain IP addresses or certain hosts, but then you also want one rule that allows access from maybe a different subnet that's got more permissions to an entire plethora of other hosts. So it's really nice to be able to nest aliases so you can, again, reference an alias within an alias. It'll make a little bit more sense when I show you. But the documentation here says they have to be either the same or compatible types. However, I've noticed that that is not exactly the case, or at least that is not how the GUI is behaving. So they say in the documentation as well. However, well, they talk about an example that doesn't work where you can't have ports and IP addresses in the same alias. That makes sense. Of course, ports and IPs are different. You would never reference those in the same spot in the firewall. But they say, however, host and network aliases can nest each other since they are compatible. But that is, again, not exactly the case with how the GUI behaves. And I've tested this both on my example machine that I'm showing you, which is a pfSense Community Edition, but this is also true in my own. I tested it on my own network firewall as well as some other ones in production running full pfSense Plus on the latest version. So this is not specific to Community Edition or like a old bug, and I haven't so far found anything. Maybe I'm doing a bad search, but I haven't found anything on Redmine about this bug. So I went ahead and created that, which you probably would see if you go search for alias issues in Redmine. So I'm going to create a new alias first to show you what it would do according to the documentation. I've got hosts selected. That's the type. And if I go in here and I type in host, you'll see testing hosts comes up. Let me add another host. Let me type in net. Testing net comes up. Both of them show up here, which seems like that's exactly what the documentation said. Cool. And if I delete both of those and I switch this to networks instead, I can't delete the last row. That's right. All right, there we go. We'll start fresh. There we go. So it's networks. Now I put in testing hosts and testing net show up. So again, seems like it works the way that the documentation would tell you that it works. But again, that's not exactly the case, because if you create an alias, when you go back in to edit that alias, it only references its own type from there on out. So for example, this network one that I created, this first alias that I had pre-created for us that says it's using testing net, which is this alias down here, it's a network type. If I open this, I should be able to select testing host as well, just like I did when I created the network alias originally. But if I open this and I do an add, only testing net shows up. Testing hosts never shows up. So that seems to be a bug, and I'm not sure what the solution to that is, if this is a GUI bug, or if you maybe aren't actually supposed to be able to nest these together and it's a documentation and GUI bug. That I'm not 100% sure on, so more to come on that. Again, I just filled out the bug report for that. So, and maybe there's intended functionality here that I'm somehow missing, but it seems, regardless, very unintuitive, and either the documentation or something in the GUI needs to be updated to make that more clear. Because if it's only when you create aliases, well, that could create a lot of chaos, right? Because it could be really confusing to some people later down the road. They may be like, oh, well, I wanted to add more hosts to this alias, and it's a network alias, and now I can't. Okie dokie. So I'm going to go ahead and jump into the port aliases, and forgive me if you hear any background noise. I'll try to cut it out in post, but my furnace just turned on, and it's close to my microphone, so there's not a lot I can do about it. I'm sorry about that. But if I move over to the ports types, this one is pretty straightforward as well. You can create port aliases. So you could create like port 443 for web, which of course you would not do this because 443 is a pre-built alias, so to speak, that you can use when referencing ports. But if I wanted to do web for port 443 and 80 so that I could reference both of those in a single firewall rule, then now I can do that, which is really nice to be able to be like, oh, I want to allow HTTP and HTTPS access to this IP address or whatever, right? Now this will also let you do ranges, which is really cool. So if I do 80 through 100, now it references all of that, and it doesn't create huge lists. It just keeps it as one entry, which is also convenient in my opinion. Now, to be clear, you'll notice that this is a colon and not a dash. It's really easy by habit to try and put a dash in there if you're trying to put a range, but you do put a colon. So this would reference port 80, 81, 82, 83, all the way up to port 100. And again, it doesn't create, it's not like the host aliases where it's going to create a whole bunch of individual port entries. It does keep it simplified here, which is convenient in my opinion. So I like that. So that's port aliases. And then there's also URLs, and this is where pfBlocker comes in, and I'll show you some other stuff about it. But URL aliases allow the firewall to basically get dynamic alias updates. These can be programmed in various ways. The documentation has a little bit more information on this. The most common use case that you'll see for this is going to be pfBlocker, because it uses these where it creates these aliases that it references, and it updates those periodically, so that the firewall pulls from these aliases and pulls the URL and then creates aliases in relation to that. So if I open this up here, these ones, you do not want to edit these. It might even say that somewhere. I do not edit this alias, but you can see here that it references this specific URL, which is a table of IP addresses. Again, you probably actually won't use URL aliases in practice that much, except through something like pfBlocker. So that's why I'm not really going into a ton of depth here, because this video will get pretty long. And even though I have used them, I really pretty much never use them except for pfBlocker. So that's the most common. But again, reference the documentation if you need to use these for some reason that's not like just pre-built by a package like this. Now, the reason I mentioned pfBlocker is there's one other really important thing to understand here. And in fact, if you are an avid user of pfBlocker, as a lot of pfSense users are, it's a very, very useful package that can do a lot of crazy cool automation around DNS and IP, block lists, whitelists, etc. It's a great, absolutely amazing package. I think it's kind of an essential to have in pfSense, in my opinion. Now, pfBlocker has a way to do custom rules, but those custom rules can only be referenced to network type aliases, even if you're referencing a single IP address or a list of IP addresses. So that's something also to keep in mind. And this is where I feel like the documentation or GUI or something needs to be updated. I feel even stronger that something needs to be changed here. Is if you go and create a whole bunch of host aliases that you want to use as hosts, but then you also want to use all of those same host aliases inside a nested alias so that you can reference them with a pfBlocker custom rule, which I'll show in a second what that custom rule looks like. The issue that you'll have is you can create a network alias that references all of those host aliases so it's nesting all of those. It's the parent of all of those. Parent might not be the correct term, but you know what I mean. So if you do that, and then you want to add more hosts to that network alias later, as I showed earlier, due to whatever bug or whatever is causing this, you will not be able to do that. And so now all of a sudden you end up having to create network aliases instead that are a bunch of /32s to reference hosts. A little bit weird and a little bit clunky, and could get pretty messy pretty fast if you're not careful. So if I go over to pfBlocker over here, go to IPv4, I've got one created, or no, I'm going to create a new one. Actually, let's not use that one. Let's not use I'll add a new one. So I'm going to add a new one. The custom rule stuff down here, and this is not a pfBlocker tutorial, so I'm not going to be going into the depths of how all of this works. If you want to see that in another video or something, definitely let me know. But down here, I'm just going to use a custom destination, right? If I want to reference those, you notice how testing net came up, but testing hosts did not come up. So testing net came up, testing hosts did not. And that is because, again, you cannot reference hosts. You have to reference something in CIDR notation, which is the way pfSense or pfBlocker is built. And so you'll see here, it says do not manually enter addresses. And that's to make it so that, well, I don't know all the reasons behind that. I didn't program pfBlocker, but I assume that the reason for this is that this will not understand an IP address. It will only understand CIDR notation. And by doing this, it makes absolutely sure that whatever you're referencing is in CIDR notation, because you have to reference it based on an alias, and that alias will only come up if it is one that is a network alias, meaning it's in CIDR notation. So that's another factor here. I think ports come up regardless. I can't remember, did I even create one? But yeah, so port aliases, should come up regardless. If I go here, I believe you can still reference those, but you can only reference network, not host aliases within the pfBlocker custom rules. Yeah, web does come up. So that's an important note there, because if you're going to build out all of your aliases, Right now, if you plan to use PF Blocker and you're going to be using it very extensively and potentially using a lot of custom rules, my personal recommendation would be to build them all out as /32 network aliases, which is kind of annoying. It's not a huge deal, but it's kind of annoying, so that you can reference them in PF Blocker, even if you're going to be nesting aliases, so that you can reference them as nested aliases as well. Now, maybe something will be fixed around this, again, whether it's the documentation or whether it's actually a bug in the system, in pfSense, where maybe you are supposed to be able to do this, but I'm not 100% sure on that. So the bug report has been filled out. Hopefully we get a resolution on that soon. But that pretty much covers everything that I had to talk about this. So that is pfSense and its aliases in pretty good depth there, along with covering a bit of a bug that you might want to be aware of before you go building out a bunch of firewalls in production. If you guys want to see more content around pfSense, definitely let me know. It's something that I have extensive experience with and would be interested in talking about more. So I probably will create content here and there on it, but there are a lot of creators that create a lot of really good content on pfSense, so it could end up being redundant. So let me know if you want to see that, or if there's something more specific you want to see, maybe a more in-depth test or something along those lines. But thank you everybody for watching, and I'll chat with you all in the next one.